we need to protect the quality of that discourse. And that means when people are putting forward good faith arguments and not using those arguments as political dog whistles or as weapons to attack a group or do something harmful, we need to protect them, even if we don't agree. Because when we protect someone that's putting forward a well-reasoned argument, we're not protecting the idea that they're sharing, we're protecting the discourse itself.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I have Kyle Gibson from the University of Canterbury. Kyle recently wrote an article about what is science and the relationship between Māori traditional knowledge and science. So Kyle, thank you very much for coming on the show. First of all, would you just like to explain who you are, what you've studied, all those sorts of things?
Sure. Michael, thank you very much for having me. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of Canterbury. My field is philosophy. My thesis was in moral philosophy in particular. I got here because, as you mentioned, I wrote an opinion article in Stuff about the nature of science and how it relates to cultural knowledge. I wrote that article in the aftermath of a letter to the listener about the relationship between science and cultural knowledge and caused quite a kerfuffle.
So you did a degree in philosophy and you did a PhD in philosophy. Just quickly tell us what that PhD was in.
So I studied philosophy and also history, geography, and political science and secondary school teaching. My thesis was in Kantian constitutivism, which is a particular area of metaethics that deals in, well, a number of things, but most relevant to the topic today are the relationship between the philosophy of science and ethics.
First of all, can you describe what ethics is?
So ethics is how we decide what we should do, which gets very difficult when we try and carve that apart from areas of our life that don't appear on the face of it to be ethical. For example, it's clearly a matter for ethics when I decide what I want to have for lunch, whether it's going to be meat or not, say, or what I'm going to do when I'm driving at night. Dare I have that extra drink and risk other people's lives? Clearly a matter of ethics. But when I'm deciding how to pursue a particular experiment, it can get a bit more questionable. Sometimes that will be obviously ethics. Can I do human experimentation when it involves a massive amount of harm? The ethicist has something to say. But what about the methodology of the experiment? If it doesn't involve any harm or risk to people, animals, or anything else, well, that doesn't appear to be ethics. Yet there is normativity involved. There are things we should do and things we shouldn't do. And the area of philosophy I find most fascinating is whether or not there is a distinction between those types of normativity. We say we should do this and shouldn't do that when it comes to ethics. Is that a different type of should, a different type of ought claim than when we say the same things about how we solve mathematical equations? Because there are, of course, ways you should solve mathematical equations and ways you shouldn't. And the same for doing the natural sciences.
So I get the sense that you've thought a lot about science. Is that correct?
It is not one of the main focuses of my thesis, but it is an area of interest to me. One of my bachelor's degrees is a Bachelor of Science. One of my favorite areas of philosophy is the philosophy of science.
Are you a Popperian, or what philosophy of science do you confer with?
The Stuff opinion piece that I wrote was written while I was sitting in the Karl Popper building, which I quite liked. Yes, I think Popper had a pretty good crack at solving the issues he was trying to solve. I don't think he finished the issue, but yes, I think making predictions that are falsifiable is a crucial element of doing science, and Popper was correct to stress that as much as he did.
So can you tell everyone what Popper was on about?
Karl Popper was trying to delineate between science and pseudoscience. His proposed solution was falsifiability. So it's science if you make a prediction that is falsifiable. So you make the prediction, and if it doesn't come true, then that will challenge the hypothesis you put forward or challenge the claims that you're making. Your theory doesn't work if it makes predictions that don't come true. And so you can falsify your theories and thereby do science rather than something else.
So science is essentially something that you can say at some point is wrong.
Yes, I think that is crucial. If you can't say that something is wrong and give a criteria you will be able to use to determine whether or not it is wrong, then it is difficult to say that you're doing science. I think there's more to it than that. And by that, I mean that science is a thick term in the sense that it means a lot of different things. And that becomes important when we're having the types of conversations that we've seen recently here in New Zealand across the media and in social media.
Well, what is science, or what does it mean? Give me a range of these definitions.
So I think science means, among other things, but most importantly in my regard, a type of normative evaluation, which makes it very difficult to discuss because it easily becomes confused with closely related but distinct normative evaluations. So by that I mean,
Can I just if you could, because again, some people will understand normative evaluations, but you just put that into sort of more plain language. What is a normative evaluation?
of course. So by that I mean, when I say something is science, I mean it's a good way of understanding the world. The people engaged in learning and understanding what they have figured out have done what they're supposed to do. You should listen to them instead of, say, listening to someone else who is doing a different activity that we might describe as a worse way of understanding the world because it's not scientific. So we might say, look, that's pseudoscience. Don't listen to the horoscopes if you want to know the weather tomorrow. If you want to know the weather tomorrow, you need to understand the natural processes involved and what is required to make predictions based off of those. And to do that, you need to do science. So, because there's that normative element, by saying something is science, you're saying that it's good. It's good at doing particular things, at understanding the world, at being testable, at being something we can revise. Well, then it is used to, in a way, denigrate other forms of knowledge. Because when you say another form of knowledge is not science, you're saying it is not as good at understanding the world in a particular sense. And by that I mean making predictions or describing how and why things have happened.
So there's a normative scale of knowledge. So we have bad knowledge to good knowledge, and it is a spectrum. So I imagine some knowledge can be good and bad, and some knowledge can be at the top of the hierarchy, but then it can actually be moved to the bottom of the hierarchy because it could be falsified.
Yes, I think that is a fair description. And notice how significant the problems that arise from that description are, because when we take science to mean that, and there are other things it means as well, but for now, just that, when we take science to mean describing this piece of knowledge as good, because it's higher on the scale in terms of its accuracy, the way it describes the world, than other forms of knowledge, well, we are attacking in a sense, and I think it's a narrow sense that we need to be careful about, which is why we had this just absolute disaster of a public discourse, because it is attacking these other forms of knowledge. When I say this is science, I'm saying it's better than other ways of describing what's happening. And if something else arises that does an even better job than what I have denoted as science, then the appropriate response to that is to say that I was wrong, or that now we need to revise our understanding and get rid of what I called science and instead put the title of science over onto this new thing that gives us a better way of understanding the world, a way that allows us to do things like make accurate predictions and explain the natural phenomena that are leading to what we see happening, that explain the causal mechanisms involved. So, because science does, as one of the things that the term means, does attack other forms of knowledge, it is easy, I think, to see why people would take science to be something that's attacking their culture. But I do not think that is what's happening. When you put forward a piece of cultural knowledge, I don't think that what you're doing is making the type of claim that science is trying to attack. So when I
Could I just pick you up on something? Would debunk be a better word than attack? Because science is not actually attacking anything in a sort of active sense, but it is intellectually debunking certain things. So if I make a claim that I can fly to the moon, you could do a scientific experiment and test whether I can, and then as a result, you'll debunk my knowledge claim.
Yes, I think that's a quite a helpful correction, actually. Thank you. Yes.
I mean, was listening to a scientist giving a speech. It was a long time ago. I can't remember what it was about. The thing I did remember was what she said about knowledge, in the sense that she said, it's not what you say that's important, it's what people think you've said. that's important. So when you use a word like attack, people will actually take that as an attack rather than really what science is doing. It's an evaluation process, and it's the best tool that humans have to evaluate so many claims. I mean, it can't evaluate all claims, but it can make an evaluation of a substantial amount of claims that can help us find the best pathway forward. And I think the evidence for that is clear because all of us live in a scientific world. But anyway, going back to the use of words, I think that's actually quite important because people will hear something completely different to what you mean.
It is, and thank you. That's a very helpful correction. An ironic one too, because it's literally the topic that we're talking about, right? Is how careful we need to be when we're using these terms. And this will likely happen again. So hopefully the listeners will be sympathetic because I'm capable of being careful about one term at a time only.
Well, we're all fallible and we all make mistakes, and the opposite of making mistakes, we do things right. What I find so interesting about the discussion is how people hear you. And again, going back to the scientist's quote, what she said, it's not what you say that's important, it's what people think you've said that's important. What I've found in this discussion and many others is that you can say X and people hear Y. Also, the definitions of words. So in this conversation, we both have the same definition of science. But when you talk to someone who has a different definition of science, that's when the conversation goes off the rails. And that's when they hear something different. Because if I say science, they hear something completely different from what I've said. So I would implore all the listeners to listen with the best intentions and with the most neutral mind. And I think that's the intentionality. If we go to normativity, intentionality is really important in conversation. By having the intentionality of the other person has something to say that's valuable, and there could be germs of truth in it, I think leaves your thinking much more open, and so you're more able to comprehend what they're saying. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think a necessary one. So again, if we use the word debunking, and again, I suppose even debunking has a negative connotation. Another word may come out in this discussion, but essentially science is, how about this? Science is verifying certain claims. And the other thing I think is worth noting about science is all claims are provisional, and how science differs from other knowledge claims, specifically religious knowledge claims. All scientific claims are provisional. Einstein can come up with a theory and I could debunk it if my theory is proven to be correct. And also science is not tied to the knower. So it's not tied to an ethnicity. It's essentially independent of the group that it emanated from or the person that discovered it. So Newton could have been a Māori in New Zealand in the 17th century, and if that person had come up with the same conclusions, they would still hold. Would you agree with all of that?
Yes, and I think it's a very important addition because when we are using science to verify claims, there are some things we're doing and some things we're not. And the relationship those claims have and the verification has to a specific person, as you just brought up, are important to how we delineate between the things we're doing and the things we're not, which then leads us to an understanding of the narrow sense in which science could be considered as a challenge to a very particular kind or a narrow subset of cultural knowledge claims and not to the rest. So what I mean by that is when I'm trying to make a particular decision, say, so for example, maybe I want to decide if I should bring my umbrella when I'm leaving at the start of the day, one might understand my decision in terms of simply whether or not I think it's going to rain. And if that's what we reduce the decision to, then it looks like we have a scenario where we might pit scientific knowledge against cultural knowledge. It would go like so. Well, should I bring my umbrella? That depends on how likely I think it is to rain. And how I figure that out is where we could see this tension. Maybe I could say, throw some tea leaves. or read my horoscope and gauge how likely it is to rain based off of that. Or maybe I could employ my understanding of the relevant natural processes, look at the weather maps on Met Service, the pressure maps, and so on.
Or you could actually go and do the tests.
Sure. So if that's how we understand the decision at hand, then we do end up in this situation where we could say, look, either you're going to go the scientific way, or you're going to go the way that maybe you identify with because of some cultural element. I don't think that's the story that we want to tell, or at least we need to tell another story as well. Why? Because there's more going on when you make any decision than simply, here's what I want. How do I get that in the best way possible? The story we need to add is the story of who you are and what it means for you to be making a decision. So let me expand on that. When I make a decision, what makes that decision mine is how it relates to constitutive elements of my identity, how it relates to what makes me.
So I'm gonna pick you up on the big words, constitutive. What does that mean?
What makes something what it is. So, what makes me what I am? Now, if I identify in a particular type of way, a very important way that's central to who I am and how I identify myself as myself, how I decide that this is who I am and this is what makes me me instead of someone else. If something involved in that process of being who I am is, say, casting tea leaves or looking at the stars or reading my horoscope, then seeding the decision of whether or not I think it's going to rain or is likely enough to rain for me to bring my umbrella to our Met Service or whomever, that's going to do more than just give me a more accurate answer. It's also going to take the decision away from being my decision because I've removed an element of who I am from the process. So when I decide whether or not I want to do something, even as simple as bringing my umbrella, I'm not just wanting to know the stats and the numbers. How likely is it to rain? I'm also wanting to know what makes this my decision? What gives me, as such, control over what's happening? And this is where the cultural elements become important because it can be more important that a decision is yours, that a decision is made in ways that reflect who you are, than it is that the decision is made with the highest chance of being correct. And if we are in a situation where we think, look, do I really care that much if I get rained on? Not a lot. Enough to put some thought into it. Probably not as much thought as we're doing right now, but a little. Well, yeah, then there is a sense in which you care about the right answer, the most accurate answer. And to the extent that you care about the most accurate answer, that is where you should be looking to scientific knowledge when it gives a different answer to cultural knowledge. But I don't care that much about getting rained on. And I certainly don't care so much about getting rained on that I would prefer to sacrifice an important part of my identity. And so it is more important to me, because of who and what I am, that I do this decision in a way that is mine. And because that is more important, then I have a good reason to cast my tea leaves, to read my horoscope, to look at the stars and decide whether or not I bring an umbrella that way. And I would say that science would find no contest with that. It's just science is not the type of thing that's going to say, look, you're wrong to want to decide this according to casting tea leaves, because science is much more limited in its scope. It is just going to say, if you want the most accurate answer, you come to me. If you want something else, then you don't.
If I can just maybe rephrase that to make sure I've got this correct. Cultural knowledge has a benefit or a resonance to one's identity. And you're saying that there's absolutely no problem if I were to use whatever cultural knowledge it is, because essentially it makes me feel good. And that is, in the scale of importance, in the hierarchy of importance, that's actually more important than whether I get wet or not. Is that correct?
That's an important question to ask because that is the answer that follows from what I've said, but there's reasons for it to not be quite correct because the follow up is that it's more accurate to say whether or not you want to make the decision in that way. whether or not you want to prioritize making your decision rather than making the most accurate prediction, that's not a scientific problem. I wouldn't go so far as to say there's no problem, because we can employ cultural knowledge to do some absolutely horrific things, as all parties to wider debate that we're talking to have pointed out. There's no shortage of cultural knowledge cultures using and engaging with scientific knowledge and doing horrible things with it. But whether or not we should be making decisions that belong to us in that way, or making the most accurate prediction, that decision is not one that belongs to science. It belongs to closely related fields such as moral philosophy, and I think the delineation there is actually fairly weak at points. But what you're not going to do is you're not going to go and say, ask a physicist to shoot some lasers at something and get some measurements, and from doing so determine whether or not it's more important that I have the best chance of being right about whether or not I should bring my umbrella, or that I get to enjoy being who I am and reflect my identity in how I make the decisions that I make. It's not going to be hands-on application of the natural sciences to determine which of those should take priority in which cases.
So there are limits to science.
There are, and I think the limits to science are placed there for very good reason, although we may find that they are fluid, like I think the threshold for something counting as science itself is. So I take science to denote the best way we have of understanding and predicting the world, which means that it becomes meshed with culture in an awkward way, which goes back to the first thing I was saying, which is science means a lot of different things. And it becomes difficult to delineate it from culture at points, because science means the best way we have of understanding the world, and that is going to change. And it is also going to be put to particular uses, and the uses we put it to will be determined by what we're prioritizing and what we're trying to do. And that's going to be steeped heavily in culture as well as a bunch of other things.
If science means a lot of different things, why can we not call traditional Māori knowledge, why can that not be called science?
Yes, so I do think that that is how this works, that this is relative. Now, notice that anyone familiar with relativism might quickly take that to be a claim that I'm not intending to make.
Just explain what relativism is.
So relativism means that a claim is relative to something else. In philosophical circles, referring to relativism can be a way of rejecting objectivity by saying there's no objective answer to this. That is not always what relativism means, because the key characteristic of relativism is where it stops. So at what point do your claims stop being relative? Or another way of saying that may be clearer to some listeners is, what is it relative to? So if you want to say and make a claim about morals, how the world works, what we should do, how we should understand particular things, and you say, look, it's relative, and you give no further information, then what you mean is there's no correct answer. Perhaps you mean something like, whatever answer I believe is true for me. If you make a more reserved claim, or perhaps a better fleshed out claim, you might say, look, the answer is relative, and it's relative to these other things, which themselves are not relative, or are in turn relative to something else, which is in turn not relative. So science works like that. In fact, I think everything works like that. It's relative to something else, but that does not mean that the relativity doesn't stop somewhere. For example, at the bedrock of the laws of thought, logic itself, those aren't relative.
So just give me an example of a relative claim.
Sure. So I might say something like, well, my chair is going to continue holding my weight throughout this entire conversation, and it's going to continue having these particular attributes. Now, that does not sound relative, right? It is referring to the way the world is, and in that sense, it is describing something objective, something mind independent, something that I can't change the truth of by changing my mind. However, my claim that the chair is going to continue doing this is, in a sense, relative to all sorts of things. It's relative to how long the interview goes on for. I'm confident, given the subject matter, we could talk until my chair fails, or it'll be a long time, but I've got it in me. This is a neat topic. Or to my chair remaining where it is. I have family coming to visit later today, and if I'm still talking in the afternoon, I think they will probably carry my chair and my tablet somewhere else, and it's going to put the structural integrity of the chair in jeopardy. So my claim about the chair doing these things and having these attributes, it is relative. But that does not mean that there's no objective answer, because of course we know I don't mean that, right? We know I mean my chair's going to stay the way it is for the next however many minutes and such. So the reason I think science works like that, and the reason I think it becomes important how it crosses over with culture, is because we use science to denote the best way we have of understanding the world, and that changes. We get a better understanding of how to use the observations and tools we have. We get better tools. We refute ideas. And so, what counts as science today may not meet the standards of science a few decades from now. And so, we might say something like what Aristotle was doing when he gave birth to the natural sciences, in a sense. That counted as science then, but doesn't now. Now, I may find myself on difficult grounds with other philosophers there, but I'm just going to plow ahead anyway and say Aristotle was doing at least some science. I would not say that if I had the ability to teleport him forward into the future and put him beside me right now. He would not be able to go down to one of the university labs or wherever and start engaging in some of his activities and do science.
He wouldn't get funding for his Aristotelian science. Going back to Popper, he uses the word demarcation. I think, the interesting thing about philosophy is it can go round and round and round, but at some point the rubber's got to hit the road. At some point we do have to actually live in this material world. So we have to demarcate where those boundaries are. Very much like property. I mean, the boundary could be an inch this way and an inch that way. But at some point, we have to put a stake in the ground and say, this boundary is here. So I think that's a really interesting point about Aristotle. Another term that I would use is proto-scientific. In terms of demarcation, I think there is a point where we worked out the scientific method that we're still using. I'm not an expert on the details of that, but it was to do with Francis Bacon, Galileo, around those sort of times. So we're talking the 17th century, aren't we? I think 1600 somewhere. The work that Aristotle was doing, it's very unlikely Bacon could have come to his conclusions without Aristotle doing his work, 2000 or 1500 years earlier. But I think Bacon and co. and post-Bacon would say that Aristotle is doing proto-science. And I also think there's again another demarcation between technology and science. Actually, just before we go on to that, I want to say something which I think is germane to the conversation before I forget. Again, words are important and definitions are important. You keep on using the word we. Now, we is the most encompassing word I think we have in the English language, isn't it? So by using the word we, not once have you said Arabic science, Indian science, Egyptian science, ancient Greek science, European science, American science, Māori science, as someone I know was telling me about feminist science. In our definition of science is the appreciation that it is a set of protocols that is open source and open to anyone. Going back to what I was saying before about the demarcation between technology and science, in today's environment, when we use the word technology, we're implying that there's a high component of scientific method in there. So what we're doing now on computers across the internet, none of those technologies could be achieved without the scientific method. No other methodologies, again, going back to your tea leaves, casting tea leaves will never create the internet. So we can arrive at technological solutions without the scientific method. Something like a bow and arrow is a technology, or even we go down a step in terms of sophistication, a spear, or even go further down sophistication, a club. I would say that's a discovery of technology through an evolutionary process rather than a specific scientific methodology. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so we can discover technologies and ways of understanding the world that do not involve the scientific method as we would term it today. So I disagree with the notion that we're not doing science. when we do those things. I also suspect, although this gets into areas of psychology that are beyond me, I also suspect that animals, when they make some discoveries, are engaged in science in a sense too. So, very broadly understood, I would describe science as understanding the world or progressing your understanding of the world. And so anything that progresses your understanding of the world is science. The more important question that reflects how we use the term more frequently and what we would typically understand the term to mean is it the best way of understanding the world we have? So when we learned to make spares and use them to solve the problems that we solved with them, I think we were doing science, and it seems plausible that at the time that's the best methods we had, the best methods we used to discover the spares, I mean. And so it was genuinely science. And then as we developed better conceptual methods to understand the world with, well, the methods we used to figure out how to make spares, they stopped being science, but note, did not lose their cultural significance. And this is where I think the subtle distinction between the two becomes crucial. So when I say a piece of cultural knowledge that led to understanding how bows and arrows work is not science, what I don't mean is that it didn't advance understanding of the world. All I mean is that it did advance understanding of the world. And because of that, we now had even better conceptual tools that then followed on from that. And this special term science, we use that to denote the best we have right now. And by doing so, we don't attack cultural knowledge because all sorts of pieces of cultural knowledge that retain their significance and their value have in the past been the best methods we had. And for that reason, they were science. And when they lost that status as science, because now we have theoretical physics and so on, that does not harm those ideas. That does not take away the importance that they have to our identity and the importance they have to our history. And it doesn't mean they were never science. It just means that calling them science today might give rise to confusion because the term, in its most common usage, is intended to denote the best conceptual tools we have. And they're no longer the best conceptual tools we have. So, what's happening here is I'm putting forward two definitions of science. And remember, the running theme is that I'm positing science as this behemoth term that's doing a lot of different things. So I'm putting forward at this point two distinct definitions of science that I think need to work together. One is that science is anything that advances our understanding of the world. That is limited in scope still because it does not mean issues like whether it's more important that I reflect my identity or accurately predict the weather, as I was talking about before. So it doesn't flow into things like that, but understanding how to predict things better and how to describe the world more accurately in some senses, like how much weight can the table hold, things like that. So that one sense, which is very broad, anything that advances that is going to be science.
Can I just pick you up on that? So a novel is science then. There's much truth in fiction, but it's not factual truth.
If a novel helps develop your understanding of the world in a way that allows you to better predict the future as it relates to the results of natural processes, cause and effect, then yes, it would be fair to say there's some element of science in it, at least as so far as that half of the running theme is that I'm putting forward. Because I'm positing that anything that advances your understanding of natural phenomena, how to describe the world and how to predict it, counts as science. But for exactly the reason that would motivate us to ask, well, hold on, in some cases at least, you're going to start talking about Harry Potter books and art as science because they might give rise to some advancement, some way of understanding the world that actually helps.
Isn't that just knowledge? Isn't that the actual more accurate word? That is knowledge. So I think Shakespeare's a good example because there's so much truth in Shakespeare. He was one of the great philosophers, one of the great psychologists, the greatest poet, the greatest wordsmith, the greatest playwright, all those sort of things. So there's lots of truth in his works. That's just knowledge. I wouldn't call that science.
So this is where the second half of that definition is crucial. This is why they have to come together, right? Because if you take only the first half that I posited, well, we get lost in exactly where we are right now, right? Where science means everything. Well, still not quite everything, but it means a lot. So that sacrifices a huge amount of accuracy for truthfulness, right? So if science means advancing our understanding of particular things in the world, physical objects and such, well, then it's going to refer to a lot. So it's going to truthfully describe all the things that are science, but it's not going to be very accurate, right? It's not going to delineate away things that we do not want to call science. So we've got this broad claim, furthering our understanding of the world, that successfully identifies everything we want to call as science, but isn't very accurate because it identifies a bunch of other things too. So combine that with the second definition at work when we use the word science. And that is a normative threshold, or a threshold of success, or how well you're doing something.
Can I just pick you up? Normative threshold.
So that's a measure of how well you're doing at something. So let's say I'm trying to understand the world. And so, according to the first half of the definition, I'm doing science. Well, the second thing to ask, when we put the second definition to play, this normative threshold, as I've termed it, well, that is going to ask, how well are you understanding the world? Because if you're doing a crap job, then I do not want to describe what you're doing as science. And so that half gives us a threshold of accuracy, or a threshold of efficacy. So in order to be doing science, you have to be understanding the world, furthering your understanding of the world, and then you also have to be doing it to a particular degree of efficacy. Now, that degree of efficacy is relative in some sense, but not relative in all senses. It's relative to how well it can be done in the context you find yourself in. And so this is where I will say things like, look, I genuinely think people learning to make spears on the savannah in ancient human cultures, they're doing science. Why? Because that's the best conceptual tools that they have available to develop their understanding of the world. And by being the best conceptual tools that they have, the best methods they have, that means it passes the threshold. And as we get better and better methods, the threshold rises accordingly.
Just an example, no one is driving around in Model T Fords. It's the Formula One grand final. Lewis Hamilton is in pole position. He's not in a Model T Ford. So in a sense, what Henry Ford was doing back in 1915 or something, 1910, he was having to apply science, and he used the best scientific knowledge of the day to create a technology. As I said before, technology is derivative from science, and it came out with Model T Ford. Now, Lewis Hamilton is not driving Model T Ford at the Formula One Grand Prix because, using your definition, it's actually more useful to him to be driving the car, which is, again, a derivative of the latest science and has the most impact. So I think what you're saying is actually very useful for this conversation. So far, it's actually the best thing I've heard, because in a sense, it means we can have our cake and eat it too. All the people who are very enamored with the idea of Māori cultural knowledge, whether that's people who are Māori and find it inherently valuable for their identity, and also, whether they're right or wrong, I'm not making a normative claim there, whether it's actually useful in the real world. I'm sure there are lots of things that are, but I'm not going to go down that route because I don't know. But in a sense, you can have your cake and eat it too, because you're saying, well, that is science. Maybe I should use the past tense, that was science, and still may have some validity to varying degrees, to 100%, to 0% in today's world. But the argument really is that is not science in today's term, just like Lewis Hamilton is not driving a Model T Ford. A Model T Ford was a paradigm shift in its day. Now we wouldn't call that the pinnacle of automobile technology. Have I got that right?
Yes, although I have some qualifiers to add, and that is, so notice how narrow this sense of pinnacle is in this context. So really all we mean when we say the methods used to develop the first human tools, going back to the spear on the savannah or whatever exactly, the methods used to develop that, they are no longer the pinnacle of the conceptual tools we have to develop our understanding of the natural processes that are in place in the world around us and how we can use them to predict what is going to happen and explain what has happened. In other senses, they may still be the pinnacle. So outside of that scope, they may be the best that we have, because that's not a scientific question. And by that I mean,
can you give an example of that? So what are the senses?
so for example, if I'm not wanting to develop my understanding of the world further, if I'm wanting to do something different, then science doesn't have a claim to make, right? It does not have anything to say, negative or otherwise, about the methods used to develop the first tools or whatever. Because if I'm not trying to further my understanding of the world in that sense, make a new tool or understand something new about a natural process and how to use it to predict things, well, then it's just not science's game. I might instead, for example, be using it to connect with my cultural identity, connect with myself or my community, or have a particular type of experience. Now, going and making some of the first tools that people have used, doing it maybe on the savannah or wherever it is exactly that we first came into, evolved in this. What are we? What's the term for being a human? I don't.
Homo sapien. Is that what you mean?
Thank you. Yes. So if I go back there and develop some of the earliest tools that Homo sapiens used and emulate, try even to relearn the methods that they used to do it, well, there are all sorts of ways that that might be the very pinnacle of achieving what it is I want to achieve. Maybe I want to connect with something about my history and where I've come from. And science is making no claim about whether or not that methodology and that piece of cultural knowledge or cultural artifact is good for that.
So why did you write the opinion piece? First of all, briefly state what your claim was or what your premise was in the opinion piece. You've mentioned it earlier that the public discourse has been, you didn't use this word, but quite broken or not very useful, or maybe the better word is quite dysfunctional. So yeah, speak to those things.
So I read some of the discourse around this issue after that letter was written, the letter that I am quite fond of, actually, by the Auckland professors to the listener. And in reading about the backlash against that letter, I was quite upset, primarily because I agreed with the content of the letter. And my understanding is that it has been misunderstood in a way that is unhelpful, unfair, and dangerous to all of us. I take the misunderstanding to be that the claims towards the end of the letter, where they described particular pieces of cultural knowledge from a culture that's particularly important to us here in New Zealand as not being science, that part of the letter was understood as a way of critiquing the cultural knowledge in question in a way that I don't think was present in the letter or intended by the authors. I think if you read the first, if I recall correctly anyway, the first two paragraphs of the letter, which frame the claims made later that became so provocative, I think you see that that's not what they meant, and that in context, they have very much made the opposite claims and are, in fact, there writing that letter to defend cultural knowledge and scientific knowledge at the same time. This upset me so much because I take both sides, so to speak, both of the kind of big, broadly described anyway, the sides of this division, to be arguing for the same cause. And that is to say, to be trying to remove systemic racism, to be trying to accurately and fairly present different types of knowledge and the importance that they have. And yet we have such a cruel pursuit of this debate that's deeply ironic, because the letter is responding to a working group's recommendation of what we should include in the school curriculum here in New Zealand. And that letter, the working group recommended that we include exactly the type of discussion and debate that the letter engaged in, which is just deeply amusing to me, I guess, in a sense, because look how poorly it went. The working group's dead right. We do need to have this in schools, because look what happens when we try and put it in the papers.
Sorry, just when you say this, what do you mean by this? Do you need to have what in schools?
A discussion of what it means for something to be scientific knowledge or not, for something to be cultural knowledge or not.
I mean, I have read the working paper. I didn't glean that from the working paper, that we should have a discussion about science. What I gleaned, assuming I'm right, I'm happy to be corrected, because it's only the first reading of the document. It's quite a big document. I found their suggestions to be not so much questions, but conclusions, whether the discussion of whether science was used as a dominating tool to subjugate the indigenous people of New Zealand.
I agree that it's not too difficult to read that into what the working group has placed there. And I don't have a correction to offer because you may well be right.
Can I just quote it?
Of course, yes.
Point 23 in the document. Philosophy and history of science is a unique strand of, I'm going to completely butcher this word. I'm not even going to say it. I've got to the point where I'm refusing to. My pronunciation is so bad, it's an insult to Māori speakers. But the Māori word for science. And so just anyone, I'll be criticised for this, but it's out of respect for the Māori language that doesn't get butchered by mere mortals like me. So philosophy and history of science is a unique strand in the Māori word for science, with no equivalent in NZC. It promotes discussion and analysis of the ways in which science has been used to support the dominance of ethnocentric views, among which its use of a rationale for colonisation of Māori and the suppression of Māori knowledge, and the notion that science is a Western European invention and itself evidence of European dominance over Māori and other indigenous peoples. Then they use the Māori word for science, allows opportunities to incorporate Māori perspectives and knowledge about the natural world into the classroom. In this regard, it decentralizes Western epistemologies and methodologies. Caveat, I may have read this completely wrong, but to me, they are making a substantive claim that science is ethnocentric, it's Western European, they say Western European invention, and it has been used as a tool to subjugate Māori. Have I got that wrong?
I hope you've got that wrong.
So do I.
So
because all those claims, the claim that it's ethnocentric is 100% wrong for a start. And I find that less than beneficial, substantially less than beneficial, that would even be considered. That's not laughed out of court, essentially.
it may be the case that this is what was coming out from the working group, and it may be that my reading it in a different way is more reflective of what I'm projecting, or me being too charitable. So the topics that they identify there in that particular excerpt absolutely need to be in the classroom and in the school curriculum. The notion that science is something Western, something Eurocentric, something that is a tool of colonization, cultural, literal, or otherwise, is also something that needs to be in the classroom. Notice that that does not entail that this is what science is and all that science is. Now, science, being this massive behemoth of a term, is sometimes used to refer to particular elements of Western ways of thinking that have arisen from the Enlightenment ideals. But that does not mean that that's the description of science that we should be using in most contexts. So when I talk about science most of the time, as I use the term in general, I'm referring to practices that have been developed across many different cultures, are definitely not something that Western culture, if there even is such a thing, Western culture refers to so much. When I say science, I do not refer most of the time to something that belongs to Western culture. I refer to something.
And is it ethnocentric, as they claim?
What I'm referring to when I say science, most of the time anyway, is not ethnocentric, but some uses of the term do have currency in at least some circles, enough currency that it's not a use of the term that we can just dismiss out of hand, do mean that. Sometimes when we say science, we are referring to a particular way of doing things that would be better identified as a form of cultural knowledge, but because of how difficult words are to actually use and how much their usage changes in contexts, well, sometimes by science what we mean is some of the claims being put forward by colonizers in history, some of the claims being put forward about what intellectual capacities different races
can you give
have.
us, as you go, give us some examples? So if we go down that list, so claims by colonizers.
When colonizers came down into Sudan and they approached the people that they were colonizing.
Did you say Sudan?
Sudan, sure. That was where I taught history, where my first teaching gig was.
Oh, in Africa?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay,
So
great.
it was a good time,
Yeah.
except for all the ways that it wasn't. But, so when the colonizers came down into Sudan, and they treated people in particular ways and regarded their qualities as suited for particular types of work, when they say this is what these people are capable of, this is how they should be treated, they're doing something like psychology, and what they're doing is also ethnocentric. It's also, well, it was, right, because this is historical. It was also Western. And there's a lot of senses, very important senses, in which it was not science. But if you were to go back in time and watch them with your notepad, it might be so easy to describe them as using the science they have to be ethnocentric, to
Or
justify
what
their claims.
they thought was science.
Exactly. The
So
reason,
just on that point, let's say there's a canonical definition of science, derivative of Bacon and et al. I can go into a situation, say I'm using science, but I'm actually not adhering to that canonical definition or methodology. Am I doing science if I call it science, but it's actually not science? I'm saying I'm doing one thing, but I'm actually doing another.
well, exactly. That's the question that arises, and it's not a simple one because you could find yourself in such an odd context, some particular point in our history where our understanding of the world was much worse than it is today, and you might be doing the cutting edge of science. You might be using the best conceptual tools you have, but the conclusions that you get to are that the tribe over there, which makes their spears in a different way or what have you, are in fact inferior creatures that will pollute the gene pool, or some absurd claim like that. And so you go and kill them. Well, are you doing science? It's difficult to answer. Any sense in which you're doing science would speak only to whether or not you're accurately understanding the psychology of those people. And of course, you would not be. You would be wrong. But there's a sense in which you might be doing science. It is certainly not what we refer to when we talk about science today, because the people that were coming to those conclusions that did speak to ethnocentrism, that did speak to particular Western points of view. I've split examples there because I was talking about spears on the savannah and then went back to colonization, sorry. But they were just wrong, right? And what tells us they are wrong? This is where we get to the key point, where I think we can marry up the position in the letter from the listener to the position put forward by the working group, at least as I'm trying to read it. And that is the way we figure out these historic uses of science to support ethnocentrism and to be used as a tool of colonization, we figure out they're wrong because we use science. They were wrong about the claims they were making in terms of the genetics of those people, in terms of their psychology. They were wrong about the claims about how well their societies functioned, and so on and so on, and how much they understood. We figure out they were wrong because we use the best conceptual tools we have today to look at the psychology of these people, to look at their genetics, to look at the claims that were made. And the claims that were made were wrong. So notice that it is science that was correcting these errors that people were making when they tried to understand the world. And so we have different senses of the term. In one sense, you could call science ethnocentric and a tool of colonization, but that is not the sense that we use when we say we want to teach high schoolers science. When we want to put science in the high schoolers' classroom, we are not talking about that.
They're sort of mixing their metaphors in a way. Again, it gets down to the semantics of science, what the actual word means. If you're a 15-year-old in a science class and they're using science, it was used as an ethnocentric tool to dominate the indigenous peoples. But let's do some science now. Let's do this experiment X, Y, Z. That's very confusing because, sir, why are we doing science if it's a tool to dominate and subjugate the people who first arrived in New Zealand? Isn't that immoral? I view the whole thing as a category error where they're lumping the wrong thing in the wrong box. The way I think is nothing is beyond criticism. So rip in with full gusto into anything, into what I say, into what Aristotle says, what this culture says, whatever, full on skepticism about everything. We should be having those discussions, but not while we're dissecting frogs in the science laboratory and discovering the processes of how we do to clarify the term modern science. Those discussions that this paper have put forward should be in social studies, in philosophy. Again, going back to category era, we don't put rugby training in the English class because that would just be silly. We could do it. We don't put Shakespeare in physics. We could do. If you did a cost-benefit analysis of doing something like that, you'd discover it probably wasn't the best thing to do. What do you think about that idea of a category error?
So I have what I take to be an agreement with the underlying assertion, but a disagreement with some of the specifics that I think put us in agreement. And that can be, we will find out, that can be quite exciting, right? Exciting to people like me anyway. So I do think that we've got a difference in kind that's not being acknowledged, made worse by the fact that the term refers to so many different things, and the term itself involves these messy things I was talking about before, normative thresholds and such. Okay, so what's the significance of that, and what correction do I want to make? Well, in terms of where it goes in the school curriculum, I do not think that this discussion belongs in social studies. Parts of it do, sure, but those parts, my understanding is that they are already there and already engaged in. I do think that this topic belongs in the science part of the curriculum, but that is because I think the science curriculum has a very significant problem that requires addressing. We do need to talk about what counts as science, what was science in the past, what is science now, and what science should be going forward. I do not think that is a small subject that can be fit into a single unit or a small part of the science curriculum. I think doing so risks the very significant confusions that you're pointing out, and that is that if we describe science as something that has been used to colonize, as something that in some contexts has belonged to a particular culture, although notice that would be using the term in a different way than we have for most of the conversation. If we describe science in those ways, you're damn right, we will confuse our teenagers in the science classroom. I mean, frankly, we're going to be confusing them anyway. I was confused most of my high school career.
I'm still confused.
So when I say it belongs in the science curriculum, what I mean is that the philosophy of science is hugely important, and it needs to be there alongside the science curriculum and not in the physics classroom, not in the biology classroom. We need philosophy of science and other related elements of analytic philosophy there as their own subject. We can't chuck it into social studies. There's already so much there, and they already cover the parts of this that are relevant. We need to talk about these issues. We need to talk about the nature of logic. We need to talk about what makes one type of knowledge different than another. So, theories of knowledge referring to epistemology. We need to talk about what exists in what sense and what exists in a different sense. Fictional objects or real physical objects or conceptual objects like numbers, theories of metaphysics, how we know what exists, how we access it, and so on. These go alongside, in very important ways, the philosophy of science, and they do not belong anywhere separated too much from science that we already have in the curriculum, and they also don't belong in the same classroom as the biology and the chemistry and the physics. We just need analytic philosophy as its own subject in high schools, probably earlier, but at the very least in high schools, and we need to be talking about the nature of knowledge, the nature of existence, and the nature of science, the scientific method, and so on. It's appalling that we do not have logic, epistemology, metaphysics, the philosophy of science in the high school curriculum. There's a lot, of course, that we include in our curriculum which makes it difficult to suggest that we should put more in. What we need in there, in terms of what analytic philosophy can add, is so important.
Sorry, can I interrupt? What is analytic philosophy?
Sure. So that's the application of the laws of thought, of reason and logic itself, to solve purely conceptual problems. So it stretches from the nature of logic, what counts as logic and what does not, and why, to all of the things we've been talking about here today, the philosophy of science, right down to important elements of ethics, although perhaps not all of ethics, the best parts, I would say. So when I suggest putting analytic philosophy in the curriculum and go even further and say this should be the core element of the curriculum. Everything else comes afterwards. I say that because we have the vast majority of our successful high school students, and by successful, all I mean is those that finish the whole lot and do well academically. And I don't mean to denigrate other forms of success, but even those that have been successful in that academic sense, we have the majority of them leaving school without even knowing the laws of thought, the most foundational tenets of logic, the law of non-contradiction, and so on. I won't expand on the laws of thought because any listeners that don't know them, which is unfortunately going to be most, I would guess, should punch them into Google plus the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and go have a look at those foundational tenets of what it means to understand something or to make a claim. What is the law of non-contradiction? Well, these are things that, of course, we should all know because we can't make coherent claims. We can't understand the world. We can't do science, history, social studies, and everything else if we don't understand the nature of reason and logic. Of course, we develop our understanding of reason and what it means to put forward an argument in the applied sense. We get better at it, kind of fumbling our way there, but we're not directly taught it, for most of us anyway, which is absolutely absurd.
It's putting the cart before the horse.
Absolutely.
It's getting everything upside down. Really, what you're talking about is providing young people with a set of tools that they can go and apply to the world out there. And I was listening to a podcast last night, and they talked about well-defined problems and ill-defined problems. 1 + 1 is a well-defined problem. How to have a conversation is an ill-defined problem. And what this scientist was saying was that in school, we really cover well-defined problems, but the real world is made up of a whole set of ill-defined problems.
Yes, and the bridge between the two is a matter for analytic philosophers, clarifying the conceptual landscape, figuring out what counts as a criteria for a correct answer to this question, but not that one. That, of course, is a conceptual problem in the sense that we need to bridge the concepts involved to what we actually suspect is involved or find might not be involved. And it requires using reason and logic to make those connections or delineate between connections that have been made and shouldn't have, or could be made and should. And so we have a discipline that underlies all of the other disciplines, that is extremely rigorous, that is well taught in our universities here in New Zealand, and yet is not finding its way into the classroom. Now, it gets even worse, actually, because the New Zealand curriculum does have as one of its, I can't remember what they're called, core tenets or core competencies or something, metacognition, which refers to thinking about thinking, understanding which ways you should think and which you shouldn't, which is smack bang in the middle of analytic philosophy. It is what they do. And yet, despite it being one of the core elements of the New Zealand curriculum, they have failed to place it into the classroom under the umbrella of the discipline that focuses on exactly this. I know I'm speaking in strong and passionate terms because I do feel strongly and am passionate on this topic. It is a very embarrassing failure of our education system, our politicians, and our demands as a New Zealand public that we have not got analytic philosophy in the high school classrooms, at least, with credits attached right now in schools all around the country.
Why not start it on day one? Can you teach thinking skills to a 5-year-old? I would posit you can, having had 2 5-year-olds in the past.
So I'm actually maybe more sympathetic to the inclusion of philosophy we already have in the primary school classrooms in New Zealand. I think they're doing a better job. I do think we could improve, and that would be by having elements of what is explicitly philosophy from day one. I think the shortfall is not as large, in part because as you go from day one and you get instead to day whatever it is once you're starting to get into year 9, 10, and then especially 11, 12, and 13, well, what it means to be doing analytic philosophy well becomes harder to deliver if you're not explicitly delivering philosophy with trained experts. And so, yeah, I think we should start it on day one. The primary school teachers are doing a decent job here. The high school teachers less so, but not because they are making mistakes, because this is not what they are there to teach. They're not there to teach philosophy as such because it's not a subject.
Philosophy has an air of being a rarefied art. And I always like the question, what's the point of philosophy? So answer that question, because a lot of people, well, I'd say 99.9% of the population go through life not even knowing what philosophy means. They live very productive lives and are very successful. So what is the point of philosophy?
So firstly, it's worth noting that what we have done here today is philosophy, and notice that everything we discussed is crucially important to the well-functioning of our society. So already we have demonstrated to any listeners the value of society through and through. But to be more direct in answering the question, well, what is the value of philosophy? Notice that you cannot even answer or ask that question without proving the value of philosophy, because that is a philosophical question. If you want to know what the value of this discipline or that discipline is, well, you already are engaging in philosophy. And you better believe that we do indeed need to know what the value of this discipline or that discipline is. Of course we do. We need to know what counts as good science and what doesn't, what counts as science and what doesn't. And if we are not engaging in philosophy, then we are not figuring that out. Notice that that means we are doing philosophy, all of us, all of the time. There is no scenario where our citizens and our students are not learning and doing philosophy. What we have at the moment is them not being formally trained and them not doing it very well. So it's not a question of whether or not we should do philosophy, because we have to do philosophy. We have to figure out what's of value. We have to figure out what counts as knowing something and what doesn't. We do it all of the time.
Maybe how about this for an analogy? Philosophy is glasses for thinking. For example, I'm nearsighted, so things are fuzzy far away slightly, so I put glasses on. That's glasses for eyes. Philosophy is glasses for thinking. It clarifies what generally is naturally quite fuzzy thought, because the great irony of human beings is that we are not built for rationality in a large part of our thinking. So we're sort of designed for, I mean, you know, I'm sure you know Daniel Kahneman's book. There's fast thinking, which I suppose is reactive thinking, and then there's slow thinking, which is where you really nut out a problem and work out the best strategy forward. We tend to be reactive in our thinking. We also tend to be myopic, and when I use the word we, I include me. And we tend to think in the way we've thought historically. So if I thought X 10 years ago, probably in 25 years, I'll still be thinking X. So it goes right back to what is the point of education? Is it just to fill someone up with a whole series of information? Information is important in itself in thinking. I would say the importance of education is how to think rather than what to think, because if we can learn how to think, then we can work out what to think ourselves.
Yes, I agree. And let me agree by reconciling our positions, which I think are the same, although differently phrased. I like the glasses analogy. Yes, glasses for thinking, or taking off your blindfold when you're walking through the minefield. So that's the sense in which I think we all do philosophy, and it's not optional. And by that I mean, if you're going to walk through a minefield, you're going to find out where there are and are not mines. Now, you can do a better or worse job, and that's where I think you might delineate between whether or not you're doing philosophy. If you blunder through with your blindfold on or without your thinking glasses on, then you might be said to be not doing philosophy. Although notice that you're still facing the same problems, you're still tackling the same issues. And that's where I think we agree is, yeah, we should be teaching our kids these tools of how to think, because they're going to be thinking anyway. And so they better know how to do it with the best conceptual tools we can offer. To our education system's credit, I take that to be the core tenets of the curriculum that I first learned as the core curriculum document when I went to Teachers College. And the new one, I'm not actually sure if they've published the new version or just those little bits of it. I haven't been keeping fully up to date. But their ideals, I think, their aims are in the right place. There are some misses that I think would be corrected by and large by making the focus explicitly on analytic philosophy. When they say metacognition, thinking about how you think and how you should think, they mean elements of philosophy, and so they should be delivering it that way. Use the tools that are there. It's a very effective field. We have philosophy of science for a reason. We have philosophy itself for a reason. We have logic for a reason. Put them there. They're trying to do the right thing. they're not using all of the tools at their disposal. And so some of the time they're not getting the results that I wish they would get. And I think we're not far off a very effective education system. I'm pretty impressed with it. I think that philosophy has essentially what's missing.
Can you tell us something about the objections that have been put forward in the media to the professor's letter in defence of science?
The rejection of the letter and the overwhelmingly negative response from at least some quarters has been based on a misunderstanding of what was being put in the letter. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a refutation of what is in the letter because the condemnation and discussion is based on this misunderstanding. So, for example, one of the arguments put forward in the letter is that comparing and contrasting cultural knowledge to science, which is something that we will do if we put them as equal, because when we say this is equal to that, one of the things we're doing is saying they're the same kind of thing. They're the kind of thing that can be compared, the kind of thing that can be as good as at this particular task or that particular task. But as the letter points out, although not quite in these terms, that's not what cultural knowledge is. And you do a disservice to the culture and the cultural knowledge itself when you do that, when you say, this is science, this cultural knowledge is science. Well, some pieces of cultural knowledge may well be science as well as cultural knowledge. They may well be both. But trying to say that this piece of cultural knowledge is science just because of the value it has as cultural knowledge is just treating it as something that it's not. And by doing so, you harm all involved because you put the onus on the cultural knowledge in question to be able to do the same things that science does. But the value of this knowledge is not found there. It's not found in the fact that it can predict the future as well, or it's not found in the fact that it can explain the natural processes as well. And it shouldn't be. That's not where we should look to find the value of this cultural knowledge. Maybe some pieces of cultural knowledge can explain the natural processes well and can predict the future well. And those pieces of cultural knowledge will have another type of value and, of course, then belong inside the scientific canon. But the pieces of cultural knowledge that don't do that don't explain natural phenomena as well as other things, that don't predict the future as well as other things, they do not suffer a loss of value because of those failures. And we should not be trying to cast them as the same kind of thing, or else we're going to harm everyone involved and end up in a ridiculous debate like we have here. I haven't seen anyone speak to that claim from the letter. As far as I'm aware, it seems to have been missed. I hope I have understood it correctly. Perhaps I have projected something in there, but I don't think so. I take the letter to be saying that science is not Western. Science is something that all cultures can engage in, and it is something that we can do in a specific and fairly narrow sense outside of culture, like math. All cultures have mathematical knowledge, but not all cultural knowledge is mathematics. And when a specific culture doing maths in a specific way fails to figure out the right answer, the culture is not harmed in its value, even though it has not done maths as well as some other group. That's not something that the culture needs to wear as a necklace of shame. That's just, well, two different kinds of thing. The value of the cultural knowledge and how well it solves mathematical equations or how well it solves scientific problems. So that claim, plus the claim that we shouldn't be trying to make these into the same kind of thing or we harm everyone involved, that's what I take to be the argument of the letter. We need to recognize that science does not belong to Western civilization. Science belongs to everyone, and everyone is engaged in doing it when they're furthering our understanding. I have not seen a refutation of that claim, and I do not expect to, because why would you? Who would argue against that claim? Had the letter been read in the way it was intended, and the way I think it actually put fairly clearly, although perhaps the people that wrote it will come forward and say, what's that Kyle guy talking about? We really did mean this other thing. But assuming they don't say that, then I don't think that we've really gotten much from this whole debacle, this whole debate, because there hasn't been a condemnation or an argument against the claims that were actually put forward. There has just been a condemnation of people based on things that they did not say.
Which is very disturbing.
It is.
Cultures do not progress with the increase of irrationality.
No, they don't. for a given understanding of progress, but I think it's, not.
Well, what I mean by progress, cultures don't flourish. So human well-being in the general sense is not increased with the increase of irrational thinking. And especially when it comes to the functioning of institutions, the application of policy, we want to be more rational than irrational. Irrationality, leads to very bad outcomes, and you don't have to go down the history route to find. It doesn't take long to find a view, especially in the 20th century. No one has pointed this out, but there's an incredible irony that in 2021, someone has to write an article entitled In Defense of Science. These things should be axioms, well, they are axioms that our society is based on. For example, without science and mathematics, a whole range of things, we would all be far more impoverished. We've got 7 professors. We're not talking about radical Nazis or radical this, radical Marxists or whatever. We're talking about people who have had long and distinguished careers, prestigious, sought after positions in one of the world's best universities. Auckland University is in the top 200. They not only have the legal right to challenge concepts and precepts in our society, but it's actually in legislation that says academics have the legal right to challenge existing norms and precepts. This whole episode says more about the people who are trying to negate them than it does about the professors. They haven't engaged in a rational, logical argument. There's no point of refutation. If they were in a court of law, they'd be laughed out of court because all they're saying is, my feelings are hurt, I'm offended, how dare you, clutching their pearls. That's fine, you can be hurt and offended and all that, but to actually have ad hominem attacks, one of the professors having to stand down, I find that perplexing. These are not good things for a society.
They are dangerous in the extreme. The tools, and by tools I mean the approaches to solving what was perceived of as a problem. So someone has said something, what are we going to do about that? The tools that we used, I think, do have their place, but were misused, and their misuse is extremely dangerous. So what do I mean? Well, had the letter been, say, an argument that there was no Holocaust and it was all some conspiracy by some secret world order in order to progress some particular agenda from some racial group, had the letter said something like that, I would be hesitant to condemn what has happened. It would sound about right that the best way to respond to that is primarily with condemnation and referring to the harm that's being done and not taking the claims seriously because they're absurd on their face. Refutations would still be relevant, but I don't think that the refutation would need to be a core element of the discourse because the refutation is essentially so straightforward and most of us would be able to figure out on our own there was a Holocaust and there's not a secret world order of a particular racial group doing these things. But that's not what the letter was. We got a response that was extremely inappropriate given the content of the discussion at hand. And when we respond in this way to this type of discussion and this type of idea being put forward, an idea that, as it turns out, to put it bluntly, is correct and is the way we should be approaching what science is and how we treat it and what context we compare and discuss it in with cultural knowledge. We take these very powerful tools of condemnation, of digital burning at the stake, or however we call it, and we use them in a context they shouldn't be used. And so the massive amount of harm they can do is turned upon our discourse, the quality of our rational discourse, instead of turned upon the people that we do want to condemn, that should be burnt at the digital stakes. We should not misuse those tools. The mob justice of Twitter and so on, they are powerful and they can do a lot of damage, like in this case.
What do you think about the claims of racism?
I think that the saddest element of all of this is that everyone involved is trying to reduce in a meaningful and important way the role systemic racism has in, well, the science classroom primarily, but in how we treat knowledge broadly in our society. That's what the letter is arguing for. It's arguing that we should not be understanding science as something that's inherently Western. We should not be trying to take cultural knowledge and derive its value from how well it compares to science.
A big bugbear of mine is definitions, because again, you say X and generally people think Y. What is systemic racism?
So, systemic racism I take to refer to impacts that are racist. So, impacts that discriminate against a group based on their ethnicity, or in effect end up discriminating against people based on their ethnicity without there being the explicit intention of the people they're engaging with. So, for example, we might have a classroom environment that provides particular comforts in terms of the visual surroundings, in terms of how you were greeted when you walked in the door, in terms of how you're responded to when you take particular actions or put forward particular body language. And those behavior management techniques, those methods of teaching in the classroom, they may work well for one group and not another. And as a teacher,
Is there empirical evidence
of there being such a thing as systemic racism?
No. Is there of what you're talking about? I can see how, a certain cultural milieu can have a beneficial effect, and I'm not questioning that. I'm a humanist. I've said this before. I find the whole discussion of race mind-blowingly boring, because I think it's the least important thing about us. And again, I'm going to get my head chopped off for saying this, but I'm happy about that. I view race as just the degree of melanin in your skin. Really, that's all it is, as far as I'm concerned. We're biologically human, and that's what we have most in common from a biological perspective. I've almost zero melanin in my skin, and I'm unbelievably envious of anyone who's got more than me. To me, it's a massive privilege to have high degrees of melanin. Why I like framing it in that context is because it just makes it sound so ridiculous, which is what I think it is. But we have cultural milieus which are different. I don't think they're necessarily predicated on the degree of melanin in your skin. A friend of mine a long time ago said we live in a cultural supermarket. I know people who ostensibly look Pākehā but are Māori. That's their identity. I think there is probably a lot of value in applying the appropriate cultural milieu to the culture of the student. Is there empirical evidence to say that if you teach according to the cultural background of the student, is there a better result? And before you answer that question, the problem with that is we live in a multicultural society. In one classroom, you can have Jews, Christians, atheists. So those are all different cultures, regardless of ethnicity. Then you've got ethnocultures. You can be Polynesian, you can be Māori, you can be Turkish, you can be German. So where do you stop? There's so many variables. Do we say, okay, we've got to teach to one culture, or do we separate? So there could be a lot of value, but I think in the generic sense, I really question that approach.
So, in terms of the melanin in skin and such, yes, I think you're correct to identify the primary thing we're denoting when we talk about race and things like systemic racism is cultural interactions between people that may or may not look different, but have cultural identities and cultural elements that change the way they interact with each other and interact with particular parts of the world. I don't find anything to disagree with there at all. When we are interacting with people from a different culture than our own, we will have to take different actions accordingly in some regards. We might have to do different things to make them comfortable, or provide different things if we want them to be able to interact with us in a way that allows us to be comfortable. So, regarding what race is and how that relates to systemic racism, I think you're correct to identify cultural elements as what's really at play here. I don't think we need to look hard at our biology when we're talking about systemic racism, and what exactly makes our skin look different and such. I imagine there's important things to be learned there to a limited extent, but in terms of the actual interactions we're having, the harm we're doing to other people, I think the cultural elements are far more important. Note that those will, of course, relate to how we look, because how we look is going to determine how other people treat us, and some of those differences in how we look will be what we typically describe as racial. How that relates to evidence, unfortunately, I don't know what the evidence looks like in terms of the best approach to teaching students from a different culture than your own or a different culture from their peers.
Well, you've had experience. You taught in Sudan.
So
Well, I mean, were you teaching Sudanese kids,
I was
or were you
te-
teaching
I was teaching
in a
primarily Sudanese kids,
yeah?
and yes, I have. So note, of course, that my personal experience does not constitute empirical evidence of a particularly important kind. So we have a situation where racism of a systemic kind, where a science curriculum focusing on some things and not others, might be slightly more favorable towards some groups and not others. That may or may not be true, but it's possible that we could create a curriculum that gave rise to that problem, and we may have done so. One of the ways that you might try and fix that is by including things that a group which is disadvantaged feels comfortable with and is more able to engage with. Now, if that works while delivering what the curriculum is supposed to deliver, that sounds great. That sounds about right. If it does harm instead by accident, say, well, then you have something that we shouldn't be doing, because solving the problem is what matters, not how we appear when we're doing so to a particular set of, say, perceptions or ideals. So when the letter by the Auckland professors to the listener points out that we do harm to cultural knowledge and the cultures who have that cultural knowledge by comparing and contrasting it with science, I think that they are protecting everyone involved, including the culture that would have its knowledge compared to science. Because no one's cultural knowledge, and it doesn't matter who, notice most of what I'm saying, I'm trying to avoid talking about a particular culture because I don't think the particular culture is going to change the core claims that need to be made. And that is that no cultural knowledge is going to stand up to scientific knowledge, because what scientific knowledge means is the best that we have, wherever it comes from, and the best methods we have for getting it. So if you've got this thing that refers to the best understanding we have, and you want to compare something else to it, you are going to harm the other thing you compare to it, especially if it's not the type of thing you should be comparing in the first place. So we have this letter from the Auckland professors that is protecting a cultural group from having their knowledge denigrated by being compared to something that it's not supposed to compare to and it could not compare to. And then they are charged with racism because essentially they've been misunderstood. And they had been taken to be saying something like, this cultural knowledge is bad and we should not treat it as science. But what they're actually saying is all cultural knowledge is going to look bad if we try and do this with it, because it's not what cultural knowledge is for. If you take a tool, if you take something that we value and use it for something it's not intended for, it's going to do badly. So don't use it for that. That is not racist. That is, in fact, protecting against the harm that would be done if you tried to use cultural knowledge for something that it's not for. And so, who's racist in this scenario? No one. They're both trying to protect against systemic racism. And I don't think that their perspectives are actually that different. You would not see any similarities really in the public discourse. Unfortunately, it has not gone well.
Well, we laugh, but we shouldn't be laughing. That's the tragedy of it. In reference to that, can you speak to the importance of freedom of speech? In my experience, there's a significant part of what I call the narrative classes, the media, etc., that seem to have quite a jaundiced view of what freedom of speech is and its relevance and importance.
Sure. I like the term narrative class because I think it reflects well that we do have problems related to freedom of speech, and the problems we have are far from simple. So, say you jump on Twitter and you attack someone, and your peers think that your attack has merit, and so others join in. So, say you retweet something, and it gains this momentum, and the person that you're denigrating, you're attacking with this movement, really starts to feel the pain. They have a harder time getting their voice out there, and they can't make their arguments because they're being attacked personally rather than engaged with. Well, that's a form of freedom of speech itself, because, of course, me running around and insulting someone and calling them an absolute moron and speaking over them so that their voice can't be heard, whether it be on social media or on the streets, well, what I'm doing is talking, and I'm using my freedom to do so in order to make someone else's speech less visible and less plausible to others. So freedom of speech gets very complicated because I could also describe my speaking over someone else, my making it more difficult for them to be heard and engaged with, as attacking their freedom of speech. But I'm not literally stopping them from having the words come out of their mouth. So it looks like both of us have free speech in this scenario. And yet, what does that even mean? Because presumably, by free speech, we do mean something like freedom to have my ideas shared in the public sphere. And sharing my idea in the public sphere, it's difficult to reconcile that with merely the act of me getting to have words leave my mouth or tweets leave my phone. I also mean something like the freedom to engage in a rational discourse. But most speech is not doing that. A lot of the time, when we're talking to other people, especially when we're playing our games or discussing TV, we're not engaged in the activity of trying to understand the world and answer the big questions. We're engaged in something else. And because we're doing these very different things when we're engaging in maybe what you mean by narrative classes, then freedom of speech can mean very different things in different contexts too. So I think freedom of speech, as it relates to rational discourse, engaging with arguments in terms of what they are saying and where they should be critiqued, whether or not they are valid, the logical structure makes sense, whether or not they are sound, the assertions they're using to reach their conclusions are actually true. Well, that's the freedom of speech that I think matters. And that freedom of speech, it doesn't really have a lot to say about whether or not I should be allowed to wander down the street and shout insane ideas off the top of my head, because it's not clear that I'm doing that activity, that I'm engaging in rational discourse. I don't think freedom of speech has a lot to say when it's referring to whether or not I can talk about the rugby in the classroom, whether or not I have to wait until lunchtime, whether or not I should be allowed to talk about this sexual act on the streets or have to wait until I'm in private with my friends. The freedom of speech that I'm interested in is the freedom of rational discourse, and that means the freedom of speech that I'm interested in does not refer to most speech. Sorry, I should clarify. The other forms of speech are important too, but they're important for different reasons, and so we can treat them, ethically speaking, in different ways. We can regard freedom of my right to talk about whatever nefarious acts that I think are fun to just discuss. Well, my freedom to do that, I think, can be curtailed in a way that my freedom to engage in rational discourse can't and shouldn't be.
Can you just clarify that last point? So you're saying that if I want to talk about the rugby, that could be curtailed and that wouldn't be problematic, where if we want to have this discussion, if this discussion is curtailed, that would be problematic.
Yes, I think that would be problematic in different ways. So if I want to talk about the rugby, well, if I am curtailed and prevented from talking, I don't want to talk about the rugby just as a personal point, but let's say I did. If my right to do so were curtailed, the harms done would be different. And so they could be curtailed, the activity could be curtailed for different reasons and in different ways. So, for example, maybe I don't have a right to talk about the rugby while I'm filming a documentary or something like that, or when it makes someone else uncomfortable. So this, where maybe going back to kind of the sexual acts or something like that, where it's an example we're familiar with. I might want to talk about the best porno that I've seen in the last week, much like I might discuss the best rugby game I've seen in the last week. Well, if I want to discuss the best porno I've seen, it might be fair to kick me off the bus when I'm sitting, when it turns out it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon.
It's essentially, there's a time and a place.
Exactly.
And these are not necessarily articulated. It's about appropriateness.
Yes, and to bring it back to the core of the point, if I were to be prevented, if someone were to say, look, you've really got to stop talking about that on the bus or at the medical conference or whatnot, and I were, kicked off the bus or something, if I were to say then, you are curtailing my right to free speech, I would regard that claim as out of place and odd. The way to respond to my right to discuss the porno or whatever in this particular context is not to say you've harmed my right to freedom of speech, because I don't think my right to freedom of speech, it relates to that particular issue quite as well or in quite as important a manner as it relates to my right to discuss issues that relate to the natural sciences, philosophy as such, other academic pursuits that are important to understanding the world and helping our society flourish. So when I say you're hurting my freedom of speech, I would regard that claim as saying something like, I should be allowed to discuss this because it's important to the flourishing of our society that these ideas are shared, developed, and expressed. And so when I'm sharing thoughts about religion, when I'm sharing thoughts about politics, when I'm sharing thoughts about science, when I'm sharing thoughts about philosophy, those are the areas where freedom of speech has the most to say. I shouldn't maybe have gone so far as to say that it has nothing to say about the other areas, but I just think there's less important things to say.
So essentially, there's a hierarchy of discourse, and the application of the notion of freedom of speech should apply at the top of the hierarchy and then move down accordingly.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. And an example to go along with that might be if you want to shout down the person, not engage with argument, but just shout them down and wag your finger to have them stop talking to the guy discussing porno on the bus, that's probably a good move. Probably best not to get into a debate about whether or not this is the appropriate place to talk about porno, right? You don't need to do that. You just need to wag your finger. But if the person on the bus is instead discussing why this political party has said this, that, or the other thing, and whether or not they were correct to do so, you should not be wagging your finger in that context, even if you find that topic of discussion far more harmful and upsetting personally than talking about porno.
The interesting thing about what you've been talking about is the inverse that seems to be occurring in our discourse, where the important discussions or discussions of what I would term a heretical nature, where we have these domains of discourse which are held to be undiscussable. If you go back to the 14th century, we could not get out into the local village square and say how terrible the Pope is and that God doesn't exist and it's complete and utter scam, because we'd be very quickly put on a stake and burnt. The same seems to me, in my eyes, to be occurring. Again, I come from a philosophical premise that we can discuss anything. And there may be times and places, like you're talking about what can be discussed on a bus, at a higher level, philosophical level, we should be able to discuss anything and nothing's off the table. So if you wanted to tell me everything I thought, my identity, absolutely everything, was completely and utterly wrong, I'd say, bring it on. And to me, the reaction shows is that what I'd almost say two things is that saying, there's a sort of religious adherence to the knowledge in the sense that it's above critique, but also an inferiority aspect to it, because if that knowledge is so wonderful and so great, which I'm not making a claim on, I'm not saying it's great or it's bad or whatever, I'm not making any claims about Māori traditional knowledge, what's the problem? So when ad hominem claims get made against the authors of this letter, to me it just shows an insecurity of the quality of the knowledge.
So there are, I think, two important issues relevant to the point that's currently at hand. One being as it relates to freedom of speech that we were just discussing, and the other as it relates to some positions that might be being taken in important parts of the political sphere that we're operating in New Zealand as a society, as it relates to what types of claims are true and what that means and which aren't. So relativism, as it relates, broadly speaking anyway, to something like postmodernist thought. Speaking first to the freedom of speech stuff, I agree that we should be able to, and in fact should actually be taking the following actions, actually talking about them in practice. Any and every issue, political, cultural, the whole lot. Notice, though, that many of the conversations and interactions we have with people are not discussions engaged in the types of ways that will allow us to further our understanding about the world. So the claim that we should be able to discuss religion freely does not mean that we can say anything we want about religion. Let me give an example. Back to the bus, I guess. So let's say I want to discuss why I don't think God is real. And I decide to engage loudly in this discussion when I'm on the bus, but this time it's not 3 p.m. This time it's Sunday and it's crammed full of a particular church group. And so I just launch into this tirade about why God isn't real or this particular problem with this particular sect of religion that I know they belong to. The same points I might be making, perhaps even the very same conversation, might be worth protecting as a academic pursuit had I said it on maybe YouTube and shared a video, or said it in a classroom, or said it on the bus at a different time. But at that particular moment, we might point out that it's difficult to believe that I'm having a discussion intended to advance understanding of the world, and maybe saying the same things that I might safely say in other contexts here is really just me trying to attack these people when they're not interested in discussing this topic.
Well, there's a time and place, there's decorum, and there's politeness.
I think,
But in the sense of the professor's letter, these are highly qualified professors of a substantial university, many of them in the top echelons of their field. So it's not like a bunch of grads. So there's a cachet to that. They published a reasoned, non-polemic, it wasn't a polemic letter, it was a very reasoned, it was very concise letter in a national publication. So the forum they chose was not the bus talking about why God is dead to a whole lot of Christians. Their platform was all very respectful, and it was all done in appropriate taste, and that's their job. Happy for everyone to have the reactions that they had. All of their reactions were completely and utterly legitimate in their format. I thought they were less than coherent and less than rational. But primarily, I thought there's two things. I thought they're ideological, and sort of worse than that, I thought they're, I can't quite think of the word, but it's what sheep do. They follow. The other thing I think we should touch on is talking about this zeitgeist that we're in at the moment. I'm hearing a lot of comments of fear of speaking out. I think most people are very cognizant of the negative things that can happen, both to their psychology if a Twitter mob comes down on them, also they can lose their job, their livelihoods, or their career could just go sideways. And if you're a young person, it may have material effect on your long-term career. I would say, in my estimation, hopefully I'm wrong, but there is a climate of fear, which again is only going to diminish the quality of our social interactions.
yes, I think you're right, unfortunately. This is a great example. The Auckland professors, as you say, what they were doing was appropriate. And in fact, they were doing their duty. They were doing right by our society. Unfortunately, they were misunderstood, and on that basis, they were maligned and denigrated. They suffered far more than was appropriate, even if they hadn't said things quite as well as they did. But it's worse than that because they did. Well, the position they were putting forward was appropriate for the forum they were putting it in. It was not the position that was understood. And so essentially, they've been wronged. And the people who participated in that, for the most part, I think, had commendable intentions, but failed to take the time they should have to understand the situation. I suspect, unfortunately, that a fair number did not actually read the letter itself, or if they did, unfortunately, they were biased by a fair amount of what they'd read beforehand. And they should feel regret and, in some cases, shame for how they've treated these people and contributed to this issue going so poorly. Because, to refer back to the freedom of speech stuff we were discussing briefly, well, we have an obligation, a duty ourselves, all of us, to facilitate and allow for as much as is possible of our public discourse to be pursuing an understanding of the world, to be rational and reasonable, to be essentially rigorous and academic in its pursuit. And our ability to do that in the public sphere has been harmed, I think, meaningfully by what has happened. And so anyone who participated in that, even if just on social media, should reflect on their participation in that and, of course, make sure they don't make the same mistake again. When you're reading someone's position, first of all, have a genuine attempt to understand what they're saying, because I suspect that step has gone pretty far awry in this case. And then maybe actually have a listen to one of Michael's other podcasts about street epistemology for the rest of the process you might engage in. In terms of what this means for the zeitgeist, I think was the two. The intentions behind this cause of fear. And I know what you mean. Of course, when I knew that opinion piece was going to be chucked up on staff, of course I was afraid.
So you were. I was going to ask you that.
Yes.
So you didn't go, you just wake up, write it and think, oh, great, I'll see you later, and put it in the post. You actually felt fear.
Yes, I did.
Fear of what?
So I wrote the opinion piece after being upset at what had happened to the Auckland professors in terms of how they were being treated and misunderstood and then suffering because of it, the damage it was doing to our ability to have a rational discourse in this instance and potentially to some extent going forward. I took a walk around Rickenham Bush near the university, cleared my head, came back, and then found that the concern I had was still great enough that I needed to contribute. And so I wrote that opinion piece, sent it in, and then, of course, especially once I was contacted back and they let me know that it was going to be put up on the website, I felt fair because I was putting myself at risk of the same treatment. And unlike the Auckland professors, I do not have a resilient position. I only just finished my PhD. I work fixed term, short contracts at the university.
You're vulnerable.
I am indeed. And if I had kicked a hornet's nest and got kickback, well, I don't know what impact that would have on my ability to get future contracts. I would like to think that it would have had none. But after seeing what happened to those Auckland professors, it would be difficult to believe that I would be in a strong position, given that I'm essentially not, had I gotten a similar reaction.
What's the response been?
Actually, I'm lucky to say that the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I've received far more polite emails about it from people saying they agree with me and are and thanking me for writing it, which has been especially impressive because I didn't actually put my email up. And I saw a discussion about it on Reddit, a fair amount of discussion on the New Zealand subreddit, which was overwhelmingly positive that I was very pleased to see. So I got very lucky in that regard. I had only one piece of negative feedback. I only noticed it because a friend of mine pointed out that someone had tweeted about me and said that or told me off essentially for having said anything at all. And the tweet had been shared by only a couple of people and had a few of the things that indicated people liked it or whatever. So it didn't even, so I essentially got no negative reaction, which I'm very thankful for. But I, of course, was afraid. In terms of what this says about our wider ability to have these discussions and the positions we might be operating from, well, when we attack someone for a position they've put forward, we will often have the very best of intentions because, after all, we're trying to protect people from what has been put forward. So if we're trying to tell off these people that from Auckland, the Auckland University, these professors, we're trying to say, look, you've done bad and you should know that you are now a bad person in a sense, or bad enough that we need to wag our fingers and kind of burn you at the digital stake or however we put it. That is just an action of anger, but also an action of righteous indignation. It's seeking justice. It's trying to protect people. Of course, when we fail to protect people, when we fail to find justice in our implementation of essentially harm on others, well, then we've still done the harm, even though the goal of the harm has not been fulfilled. So we're essentially left, unfortunately, with us just having done a bad thing. And that is what happened in this case. And we are at risk of doing it again in the future. Why? Because we're not taking seriously our obligation, our duty to protect our ability to have rational discourse. When someone is putting forward a clear and well reasoned argument that is intended for, at least to some extent, rigorous and academic or pseudo-academic discussion to try and contribute to our political discourse or whatever discourse it might be, we have a duty to protect that and engage with it on those terms. If someone is doing something else, a dog whistle, so to speak, where you're putting forward what looks like an argument that you want people to take seriously, but is actually a call to action against a particular group or something like that. Maybe like the example we used before, where I might be discussing the nature of God's existence, but in a very harmful context, even though what I'm saying might actually be appropriate in other contexts where I could be trying to advance our understanding of the world and our political discourse by doing so. Well, we need to protect the quality of that discourse. And that means when people are putting forward good faith arguments and not using those arguments as political dog whistles or as weapons to attack a group or do something harmful, we need to protect them, even if we don't agree. Because when we protect someone that's putting forward a well-reasoned argument, we're not protecting the idea that they're sharing, we're protecting the discourse itself.